I was driving home late from work, my mind focused on the day's tasks and how long it had taken to wrap everything up. My boss had been insistent that I stay late to finalize some reports, and though I hated being delayed, I'd done what needed to be done. The roads were unusually clear, which should have been a relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening was taking an odd turn. Then my phone rang. It was the neighbor, the one who rarely called unless something was seriously off. His voice was cautious but firm. "Look, I don't mean to pry, but I thought you should know. Your wife is at that coffee shop on Elm Street. She's sitting with some guy, laughing pretty loudly. I don't think he's one of your friends." I tightened my grip on the wheel, my jaw clenching. "Thanks for letting me know," I said flatly before hanging up. That conversation replayed in my head as I pressed harder on the gas, my patience thinning by the second. By the time I reached home, the house was dark, and her car wasn't in the driveway. I parked and sat for a moment, scanning for any sign of her return. Nothing. I tried calling her, twice. No answer. Frustration simmered as I debated whether to call the neighbor back and ask for more details. Before I could act, headlights cut through the darkness. A sleek, unfamiliar car pulled into our driveway. She stepped out, looking slightly flustered but composed, and walked toward the house. The moment she stepped inside, I didn't waste time. "Where the hell have you been?" I asked, my voice firm but measured. She seemed taken aback, her eyes darting toward me. "Relax," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. "It's been a long day." "Don't give me that," I shot back. "You weren't answering your phone. And then there's the coffee shop incident. What was that about?" She sighed and ran a hand through her hair. "All right, listen. There's this guy at work, you know, the annoying one I've mentioned? He's been pestering me lately. Today, he asked for my address, said he wanted to drop something off. I turned him down. Apparently, he didn't like that because next thing I know, he's whining to the boss. And guess what? The boss took his side. I got fired." Her words hung in the air for a moment. "Fired?" I repeated, my tone sharper now. "And what about the coffee shop? Why were you there?" She held up a hand. "I'm getting to that. I went with my friend and her boyfriend to," she paused. "Celebrate my newfound unemployment, I guess." She stepped away for a moment, and that's probably when your neighbor saw me with her boyfriend. Nothing shady. I crossed my arms, unimpressed. "And you didn't think to explain this earlier?" She shrugged. "I needed to cool off first." "Cool off?" "We're not exactly in a position to lose your income right now," I snapped. "There are bills to pay, responsibilities." "You're telling me you've got no backup plan?" She hesitated. Well, she started, and I could tell I wasn't going to like what followed. "My friend's boyfriend said he might have a job for me. He didn't give details, but he's willing to come by and discuss it." I shook my head, already regretting where this was going. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly. "Some random guy is going to come into my house to offer you a job? Is this the best option we have?" She met my gaze, her expression firm. "Right now, it's the only option. Unless you've got a better idea, we don't have much choice." I hated the logic in her words, but she wasn't wrong. Reluctantly, I nodded. "Fine. Let's see what he has to say." That evening, after we had spent hours cleaning up the house and preparing the grill, I was finally starting to feel a sense of order. The yard was immaculate, the grill was ready to fire up, and I'd even managed to grab a cold beer before relaxing for a moment. My wife seemed a little distracted as she set the table, but I chalked it up to the stress of the day. Just as I leaned back to enjoy the brief calm, the doorbell rang, breaking the silence. I had no idea that what waited on the other side of the door would ruin my evening entirely. When I opened the door, I immediately regretted it. Standing there was my wife's friend, a woman who had a knack for stirring up trouble wherever she went. She was wearing one of her usual attention-grabbing outfits, leather miniskirt, pink tights, and a crop top that seemed more suited for a nightclub than a friendly visit. But it wasn't just her appearance that threw me off. Standing next to her was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a luxury magazine, clad in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. The contrast between the two was jarring, to say the least. Before I could say anything, they barged in as if they owned the place. I watched in silent irritation as the man gave the room a quick glance and muttered under his breath, "Looks like a dump." That was the last straw. I stepped forward and said, "What did you just say about my house?" He blinked, clearly startled, before backtracking. "Oh, nothing," he said smoothly. "Just thinking out loud. My mistake." He offered his hand, and I shook it firmly, making sure he understood I wasn't one to be disrespected in my own home. Despite my irritation, I allowed them to stay. My wife seemed eager for this meeting, and I didn't want to make a scene, yet. As we all sat down, the man began to talk about the supposed job opportunity he had in mind. He had a way of speaking that was both vague and overly confident. Every time I pressed for details, job responsibilities, location, anything tangible, he deflected, focusing instead on how lucrative the position could be. "It's not hard work," he said with a grin. "But it's crucial that you pay attention to the details. That's where the money is." As he spoke, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes wandered, not to me, not even around the room, but directly to my wife's chest. I felt my fists clench under the table, but I kept my composure. She either didn't notice or pretended not to, and I decided it wasn't the right moment to call him out. Still, it was infuriating. I stayed quiet, letting him continue his pitch, though my patience was wearing thin. My wife's friend, meanwhile, added nothing of value to the conversation. She giggled at every other sentence he spoke, clearly smitten with his charm and expensive suit. If anything, her presence made the situation more unbearable. I wondered why my wife tolerated someone like her, someone who seemed to bring chaos wherever she went. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on getting through this absurd meeting. After what felt like an eternity of vague promises and evasive answers, the man finally pulled out a small card. It wasn't even a proper business card, just a piece of paper with a phone number scrawled on it in pen. "Here's my number," he said, sliding it across the table. "Think it over this weekend. If you're interested, come by on Monday, and we'll get started." I glanced at the card but didn't touch it. "We'll think about it," I said, my tone making it clear that I wasn't sold on the idea. He stood, adjusting his expensive suit, and flashed a practiced smile. "Good. I'll be expecting your call." With that, he and my wife's friend made their exit, leaving the house quieter but far tenser than before. I didn't say anything immediately, letting the silence stretch as I stared at the card on the table. The oddest thing about the evening wasn't the awkward company or the vague job pitch, it was the fact that neither of them touched the food. My wife and I had put effort into the spread, grilling meats to perfection and preparing sides that always received compliments. Friends and family alike praised our cooking, but these two acted as though the food didn't exist. The man, dressed in his overpriced suit, barely acknowledged the table, while my wife's friend giggled and twirled her hair as if she were at a cocktail party. Their behavior only deepened my irritation. As the night wound down and the house finally quieted, I couldn't hold my tongue any longer. I turned to my wife, who was tidying up the kitchen, and said, "That guy isn't the right choice for you. He barely gave any details about the job, and he couldn't stop staring at your chest the whole time. Plus, your friend, she's a walking disaster. Nothing good comes from her ideas." My wife looked up sharply, her expression already defensive. "What do you want me to do?" she snapped, her voice rising. "Do you think we have a line of better options? The mortgage is due next month. Sure, we can cover this one, but what about the next? We need another income, and fast." Her words came out like a volley of accusations, each one landing harder than the last. I held my ground, refusing to be swayed by her frustration. "We'll figure something out," I said firmly. "But taking a job from some shady guy who refuses to explain what you'll be doing? That's not the solution. especially with your friend involved. You're smarter than this. She bristled at my comment, her eyes narrowing. Smarter, she repeated, her voice now a shout. Do you think I'm stupid? That I'm going to fall for some scam or ruin everything? This is temporary, just until we're back on our feet. After that, I'll find something better. Her words were heated, but there was a determination behind them that I recognized. She wasn't going to back down, no matter what I said. The argument hung heavy in the air, neither of us willing to concede. I watched as she threw her dish towel onto the counter and stepped away. You don't understand, she muttered. This isn't about pride or convenience. It's about survival. If I don't take this chance, we'll fall behind. Can you live with that? Her words left a bitter taste in my mouth, but I had no response that wouldn't escalate things further. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Look, I'm tired. Tomorrow's a big day. I've already received an email about some event they're organizing in my honor. Apparently, they're going to announce some special condition for me. Her tone softened, but her resolve remained. I need to be ready for this. I watched as she turned and headed for the bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could hear her footsteps retreating down the hall. She didn't offer any further explanation, nor did she wait for my response. I was left with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease about everything that had happened that evening. For now, I stayed quiet, unsure of how to navigate what lay ahead. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was my wife standing in front of the mirror, adjusting an outfit that immediately made my eyebrows raise. It was far from the professional or comfortable attire I'd expect for a first day at work. Instead, she wore a fitted blouse that plunged far too low and a skirt that ended well above the knee. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I sat up and asked, "What's going on? Don't you think you'd be better off in something more practical?" She glanced at me through the mirror and shrugged. My friend suggested this, she said casually, as though that explained everything. She told me it's important to make a strong first impression. Her tone was nonchalant, but I couldn't ignore the unease building in my chest. Besides, she added, turning to face me, it's my first day. They're going to be looking at my appearance, so I might as well use it to my advantage. I frowned, unable to let the comment slide. Just make sure this doesn't turn into another situation like your last job, I said, keeping my voice even. She sighed, clearly annoyed. You're overthinking it, she snapped. This is just how things are. And I don't have time for this right now. I'm already running late. I watched as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. Where's the office, anyway? I called after her. But she didn't stop, merely waving a hand dismissively as she disappeared down the hallway and out the door. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway left me sitting there, still full of unanswered questions. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about all of this was off. I decided to call her around midday, curious about how things were going. When she answered, her voice was rushed, almost frantic, and there was a cacophony of voices in the background. It's been crazy, she said, barely pausing to breathe. They threw me straight into a crisis. I'll explain everything when I get home. Before I could press for details, she ended the call, leaving me more uneasy than before. She finally came home late that evening, the smell of alcohol lingering faintly on her breath. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a looseness in her demeanor that suggested she'd had a few drinks. So, how was your first day? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She flopped onto the couch and waved a hand vaguely. Busy, she said. A lot of running around. Errands, meetings, stuff like that. Her explanation was as vague as it was unsatisfying. That's it? I pressed. Running around? She nodded, not meeting my eyes. They're still figuring out where I fit in, she said. It's a flexible role. For now, I'm just helping out wherever they need me. Her words didn't sit right with me, but I decided to let it go for now. And the special condition, are they mentioned in the email? I asked. She perked up slightly at that, a small smile forming. Oh, right. They're planning some sort of secret corporate event. They'll announce the details soon. All I know is that it's happening in the next few days. The way she spoke about it was odd, too casual, almost dismissive. I leaned back, crossing my arms. This all feels strange, I said bluntly. The secrecy, the lack of details. Are you sure this is legit? She laughed lightly, shaking her head. You're overreacting, she said. It's just how they do things. They like surprises. Keeps things interesting. Her response didn't do much to ease my concerns, but I didn't push further. As she got up and headed for the bedroom, she added, "Don't worry so much. The next few days are going to be an adventure." And with that, she disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A few days passed, and things between my wife and me seemed to settle into an uneasy rhythm. She started dressing more conservatively again, which was a relief, and her behavior didn't raise any immediate red flags. However, her silence about the details of her new job persisted. Every time I asked, she would brush off the question with vague answers about adjusting to a new role. I tried to let it go, figuring I would eventually learn more, but the lack of transparency gnawed at me. Then, one morning, I walked into the bedroom and found her slipping into a tight black dress that left little to the imagination. The sight stopped me in my tracks. "What are you doing?" I asked, my tone firm. "You're not wearing that out." She turned to me with an exasperated look. "Relax," she said. "I'm not wearing it for myself." That response didn't make much sense to me. "If not for you, then for who?" I pressed. She rolled her eyes and explained, "It's for my friend. I'm giving it to her." I narrowed my eyes, already suspicious. "This wouldn't happen to be that unreliable friend of yours, would it?" She bristled at my question, her tone turning defensive. "You have no right to call her that," she shot back. "Besides, I've made new friends at work. One of them might come over soon. We've been planning a little get-together here at the house." That caught me off guard. "What get-together?" I asked sharply. But before I could get an answer, she grabbed her bag and left, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. Later that day, when she returned home, she seemed in high spirits. "The corporate event was wonderful," she said as she walked in, a bright smile on her face. "Everyone had a great time." I tried to probe for details. "Did you take any photos?" I asked, expecting at least some evidence of this supposedly enjoyable event. She hesitated before shaking her head. "No, I didn't. I was too busy enjoying the moment." Her response didn't sit well with me, but I let it slide for the moment. That evening, as I scrolled through social media, I stumbled across a story posted by her so-called unreliable friend. It showed her on a yacht, laughing and posing with a group of people. Among them was a woman wearing a dress that looked suspiciously like the one my wife had claimed to give away earlier. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I decided to confront her. "So, when were you planning to tell me about the yacht?" I asked, my tone as calm as I could manage. She looked genuinely confused for a moment before replying, "I wasn't there. That must have been a different event. I wasn't buying it." "You expect me to believe that? Then why is someone wearing your dress?" She waved it off, saying, "I told you, I gave it to my friend. My department celebrated at the office. It was low-key. We had some drinks, played games, nothing extravagant." Her explanation did little to ease my skepticism. "What kind of corporate event is that?" I asked. "Office parties and yacht parties don't exactly match up." She shrugged, unbothered. "I know it sounds boring, but that's how it was. And anyway, remember that get-together I mentioned? It's happening in 2 days. You'll get to meet some of my co-workers then." The casual way she brought it up left me stunned. 2 days? I repeated, incredulous. "And you're just telling me now?" She didn't seem fazed by my reaction. "We'll make it work," she said breezily. "It'll be fine. Besides, there's someone very important coming. You'll see." I frowned, the unease in my chest growing stronger. "Who is this important guest?" I asked. She smiled, a hint of mystery in her eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." The day of the party started early for me. I had promised to make sure everything was ready, so I enlisted the help of a couple of close friends and drove out to the local farm to gather fresh ingredients. The ride was light-hearted, with the guys cracking jokes about how much effort I was putting into an event where I didn't even know most of the guests. One of them quipped that my wife must have been recruited by the FBI with all the secrecy surrounding her new job. We all laughed, but deep down, the thought wasn't entirely absurd. Still, I brushed it off and focused on getting the house in order. By the time we returned and began setting up, the atmosphere shifted from casual to professional. The grill was fired up, the tables were arranged, and the house was spotless. As the evening approached, a sleek bus rolled up to the driveway, and out came a mix of people, some in tuxedos, others in designer dresses. It was a bizarre sight, a blend of formal elegance and casual charm that I wasn't prepared for. My wife stepped out last, her expression beaming with approval as she surveyed the setup. "You did great," she said, leaning in for a quick kiss before being intercepted by a man I immediately recognized. It was her boss, the same man who had shown up before with her troublesome friend. This time, he was carrying a bottle of what looked like very expensive liquor. "This is the secret guest?" I asked, my voice flat. She nodded, clearly pleased with herself. "He brought something special for the occasion," she said, as though that made up for everything else. The party quickly got underway, with the guests mingling, laughing, and drinking. I tried to keep myself busy, checking on the food and making sure everything ran smoothly, but my attention kept drifting to her boss. He didn't stray far from her side. Wherever she went, he followed, his smile never faltering. At one point, he was joined by another woman, a new face, who introduced herself as a co-worker. She complimented my wife, gushing about her generosity and specifically mentioning the dress she'd given away. "It's stunning," she said. "Your wife has amazing taste." I bit back my irritation and joined the conversation, determined to redirect it. "So, what exactly does your company do?" I asked, my tone sharp but polite. Her boss smiled, his answer as vague as ever. "We have a strict confidentiality policy," he said smoothly. "But I can tell you that we work with some very important clients, handling investments and high-level transactions." It was a non-answer, but I let it slide for the moment. My wife chimed in, talking about how much she'd learned and how she'd been excelling in her role. Her boss nodded in agreement, adding that she was already being considered for a promotion. The rest of the evening passed with me playing the reluctant host. While I made small talk with the guests, my focus never left the trio, my wife, her boss, and the co-worker. Their dynamic was unsettling. Every time I approached, the conversation shifted, leaving me feeling like an outsider in my own home. When the last guest finally left, I wasted no time addressing the issue. "That boss of yours," I began. "He didn't leave your side all night. What's going on?" She sighed, her tone patient but firm. "Yes, he's intense, but that's just how he is. It's part of the job. And you know what? It's paying off. I'm getting a promotion soon. It might mean working late, but it's temporary." I shook my head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Your job is starting to feel like a spy movie," I said. "All these secrets, the weird guests, the late nights. It's exhausting." She gave me a small smile, one that was meant to reassure but only annoyed me further. "I told you it's temporary. Just trust me on this." I stared at her, trying to gauge if there was any point in arguing. She seemed resolute, her mind already made up. "I'll make it worth your while," she added, her tone lightening. "There's something in this for both of us. When the time comes, you'll see. Just trust me." I sighed heavily, waving a hand in reluctant agreement. "Fine," I muttered. Do what you have to do. Over the next week, my wife's work schedule became relentless. She started coming home later and later, often looking completely drained but oddly satisfied. I didn't press her for details immediately, figuring she'd share when she was ready. But her vague explanations and the constant delays made it hard for me to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She'd walk in, drop her bag, and collapse on the couch, muttering about how much she'd accomplished that day. I watched, unsure if I should admire her dedication or question the circumstances of her new role. Then, one evening, she came bursting through the door with an energy I hadn't seen in days. Her face was lit up with excitement, and before I could even ask what was going on, she launched into her news. "You won't believe this," she said, practically bouncing on her heels. "I've been invited to a major business conference. It's a huge deal. I'm going to be presenting a new service our company is rolling out." I raised an eyebrow, more curious than excited. "You're presenting? But you just started there. How do you even know what you're presenting?" She laughed, waving off my concerns. "They haven't told me yet. I'll find out soon enough. It's all part of their strategy." "Isn't that exciting?" I wasn't sure exciting was the word I'd use, but I held my tongue for the moment. "Who's going with you?" I asked, trying to mask my growing skepticism. She rattled off a list of names, including her boss. "Why is he going?" I asked bluntly. "What does he need to be there for?" She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the question. "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "He's the face of the company. It's important for him to be there to represent us. Besides, I'm not going alone. My friend from the team and a couple of others are coming too. It's a group effort." Her dismissal of my concerns didn't sit well with me, but I pressed on. "And what about your other friend, the one you gave the dress to? Why isn't she going?" My wife's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place crossing her face. "She's not with the company anymore," she said carefully. Apparently, she had some issues with the boss. There was a loud argument in his office last week, and she ended up leaving. I didn't get the full story. Her explanation only added to my unease. "What kind of issues?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. They didn't see eye to eye on something, I guess. It's none of my business. Anyway, it's a shame she won't be coming. She would have loved this." I nodded slowly, my mind racing with unanswered questions. My wife seemed determined to move past the topic, her focus already shifting to her upcoming trip. The next day, she was a whirlwind of activity, packing her bags and finalizing details for the conference. I watched her dart around the house, her excitement palpable. She seemed genuinely thrilled about the opportunity, which made it hard for me to voice my lingering doubts without coming across as unsupportive. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. Finally, with her suitcase packed and her itinerary confirmed, she stood by the door, ready to leave. "Wish me luck," she said with a smile, leaning in for a quick kiss. I nodded, forcing a smile of my own. "Good luck," I said, though my chest felt heavy as I watched her walk out the door. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway lingered long after she was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of unease. During her business trip, I tried to stay in touch with my wife as much as possible. I called her a couple of times each day, but more often than not, the calls went unanswered. When she did pick up, her tone was hurried, and she would always claim to be in the middle of a conference session or meeting. "It's non-stop here," she'd say. "I'll call you later." Later rarely came. After the first couple of days, I stopped expecting a response, deciding instead to wait for her to come home and give a full account of her trip. Meanwhile, I spent those 4 days venting to my friends about the whole situation. They listened, offering their own theories about what could be going on. Some of them suggested I was reading too much into it, but others were just as suspicious as I was. They urged me to keep an eye on things and to trust my instincts. It was good advice, though it didn't make the waiting any easier. By the time she finally returned, I was ready for answers. She walked through the door carrying a suitcase and a smile, but what caught my attention was the shiny new iPhone in her hand. "Where did you get that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She held it up proudly. "It's a gift from the company," she said. "Can you believe it?" They handed it out to everyone who went to the conference. Her excitement was palpable, but it only deepened my unease. "A gift, huh?" I said, crossing my arms. "And why are you back a day later than planned?" She hesitated for a moment before replying. "I stopped by my mom's place on the way home," she said. I gave her my old phone. She's been needing an upgrade, and this was the perfect opportunity. Her explanation was plausible enough, but something about it didn't sit right with me. "So, how was the conference?" I asked, steering the conversation back to the trip itself. She waved a hand dismissively. "It was fine. Busy, as you can imagine. A lot of presentations, a lot of networking. Nothing too exciting." Her vagueness was frustrating, but I didn't press further. I'd learned by now that pushing too hard only made her shut down completely. Over the next few days, her routine returned to the same pattern it had been before the trip. She started coming home late again, claiming to be swamped with work. The excuses piled up, each one less convincing than the last. It was as though the conference hadn't changed anything. If anything, it had made her even more elusive. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than she was letting on. I began to formulate a plan. Her new phone, the so-called gift, was too convenient, and the timing of her stop at her mother's house felt suspicious. I needed to see her old phone, the one she'd supposedly given away. If there was anything to uncover, it would likely be on that device. But how could I get my hands on it without raising suspicion? That's when it hit me. I'd have to visit her mother myself. If the phone was truly there, I'd find it. And if it wasn't, that would be a clue in itself. The plan began to take shape in my mind. I'd wait for the right moment, make up an excuse to drop by her mom's house, and retrieve the phone. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best option I had. I just needed to act carefully and not let her catch on to what I was doing. The morning started off the same as usual. My wife left the house early, claiming to have another packed day at work. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my keys and headed to her mother's house. I'd called ahead to let her know I was coming, keeping my tone casual to avoid raising any suspicion. When I arrived, her mother greeted me warmly, as she always did. "Come in," she said, waving me toward the kitchen. "It's been a while since you visited." Once inside, I played the role of the concerned husband perfectly. I asked about my wife's visit a few days earlier, steering the conversation gently toward her demeanor and any details her mother might share. "She seemed fine," her mother said. "A bit tired, maybe, but happy." She gave me her old phone, which was sweet of her. Said she'd gotten a new one from work. I nodded, pretending not to already know this. "That's nice of her," I replied, keeping my tone light. After a bit more small talk, I decided it was time to act. "Actually, I had another reason for coming by," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I've got a friend who's into repairing old electronics. He's building some kind of high-tech project and needs spare parts. I thought maybe you had some old gadgets lying around you'd want to get rid of. I'd pay you for them, of course." Her eyes lit up. "Well, we do have some things we've been meaning to toss," she said. "Let me see what I can find." She returned a few minutes later with a small collection of items, a microwave that had seen better days, an outdated tablet, and, crucially, my wife's old phone. "Would these help?" she asked. I nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely," I said, pulling out some cash to hand her. "This will really help my friend out." She seemed pleased, and we spent a bit more time chatting before I loaded the items into my car and headed out. On the way home, I made a quick detour to the local dump. The microwave and tablet went straight into the recycling bin, but the phone stayed with me. Once I was back at the house, I plugged it into charge, my heart pounding with anticipation. If there was anything on this device that could explain my wife's strange behavior, I was about to find it. When the phone powered up, I immediately started exploring. It didn't take long to stumble upon something alarming, a group chat labeled Big Holes. The name alone was enough to make my stomach churn, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and began scrolling through the messages. What I found was a cesspool of explicit discussions about personal relationships and workplace antics. To my shock, the chat was filled with derogatory comments about the friend who had been fired, someone I'd thought my wife was close to. The messages painted a damning picture. They celebrated the woman's departure, with several participants agreeing that she was too moral for the kind of work they did. It was a chilling realization. Whatever my wife's job entailed, it wasn't the legitimate, professional environment she'd been describing. Instead, it seemed steeped in secrecy, manipulation, and outright unethical behavior. I sat back, the phone still in my hand, as the weight of the situation settled over me. Divorce seemed inevitable. There was no coming back from this level of deceit. But a part of me wanted more than just to walk away. I wanted proof, something solid to justify my suspicions and to ensure that whatever she was involved in couldn't hurt me further. If I could gather evidence, it might even serve as a safeguard for the future. One thing was clear, the name Big Holes was a red flag that couldn't be ignored. The realization of what I'd uncovered weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't confront my wife without more information. Instead, I decided to reach out to her fired friend. I found her number and dialed, half expecting her not to answer. When she finally picked up, her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone defensive. I took a deep breath and said, "I need to talk to you. It's about my wife." For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, with a resigned sigh, she said, "Fine. Come over. I'll tell you everything." She gave me an address, and I arrived about 20 minutes later. Her apartment was small and cluttered, but it had a warm, lived-in feel. She invited me in, offering a seat on the couch before sitting down herself. For a moment, she seemed hesitant to speak, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words. "This isn't easy for me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you deserve to know the truth." She started with the basics, explaining that the secrecy surrounding the company wasn't just for business confidentiality. "It's an escort service," she said bluntly. "They recruit women under the guise of legitimate jobs, but the reality is much darker. They're expected to entertain clients and convince them to invest money into the company. Once the deposits are made, the clients are ghosted, and the money disappears." I felt my stomach churn as she described the operations. "Your wife," she continued, "is deeply involved. She's not just participating, she's thriving in that environment. The women there even compete to see who can service the most clients. It's disgusting." Her words were blunt and painful, but I forced myself to listen. She went on to explain why she'd been fired. "I refused to participate," she said firmly. "I told the boss I wouldn't do it, and he made it clear there was no place for someone like me in the company. I was thrown out with nothing." She paused, wiping away tears before continuing. "They have no tolerance for morality. You either play their game, or you're out." To back up her claims, she pulled out her phone and opened a folder filled with screenshots and videos. "This is what goes on there," she said, handing the phone to me. As I scrolled through the messages and footage, my worst fears were confirmed. Explicit conversations, incriminating videos, and degrading comments filled the screen. It was undeniable evidence of what my wife and her colleagues were involved in. My hand shook as I handed the phone back to her. "I want to take this to court," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "But I can't do it alone. I need someone willing to testify." She looked at me, her expression shifting from fear to determination. "We've been wanting to do something for a long time," she admitted. "But we were scared. Now, though, I think it's time. And I'm not the only one." There are at least 10 other women who were fired like me. We're ready to fight back. Her words filled me with a sense of purpose. For the first time, I felt like there was a way forward, a way to expose the truth and bring some semblance of justice to the situation. The fight was only beginning, but at least now, I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to take action. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected, screenshots, videos, and testimony, and prepared an anonymous report to the police. Every detail was meticulously documented to ensure there was no room for doubt about what this so-called company was involved in. I described the illegal operations, the exploitation, and the blatant fraud. By the time I submitted the report, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, I knew I'd done my part to expose the truth. Later that day, I heard through some contacts that the police had acted swiftly. They conducted a raid on the office, catching many of the staff red-handed. There were numerous arrests, and the operation was effectively shut down. The most significant victory was the arrest of the boss himself, the man who had orchestrated the entire scheme. It was a major blow to their operations, and I knew it would send shockwaves through everyone involved. My wife was among those taken in for questioning, but she was released later that day. When she arrived home, her face was a storm of anger and frustration. She slammed the door shut behind her and launched into a tirade. "I lost my job because of this," she spat, her eyes blazing. "The whole office was set up. Someone must have reported us." I stood there, arms crossed, waiting for her to finish. When she finally paused, I said calmly, "You mean the brothel?" Her reaction was immediate. Her face turned red, and she pointed a finger at me. "How dare you call it that?" she screamed. "You don't understand anything about what I was doing there." I didn't flinch. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "I know everything. The escort services, the scams, the competitions. You think you can justify that?" She was livid. "You had no right to interfere," she shouted. "I was enjoying myself, making good money. Who are you to judge me?" I couldn't help but laugh at her audacity. "Enjoying yourself?" I said, shaking my head. "Well, you won't be enjoying much now. I have proof of your infidelity. You've betrayed me, and you've ruined yourself in the process." Her anger turned to desperation as she tried to defend herself. But I was done listening. I walked past her, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing her belongings into it. She followed me, still shouting, but I didn't stop. The more she yelled, the more resolute I became. "You don't get to stay here after what you've done," I said. "You made your choices, and now you can live with the consequences." By the time I finished packing her things, she had gone from furious to tearful. But I wasn't moved. I opened the door and set the suitcase on the porch. "Go," I said firmly. "And don't come back." She stood there for a moment, staring at me as if waiting for me to change my mind. When I didn't, she finally picked up the suitcase and walked away. As the door clicked shut behind her, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, and a lingering sense of betrayal swirled within me. But one thing was clear, I'd made the right choice. She was out of my life, and now I could start moving forward without her lies weighing me down. The divorce was finalized faster than I expected. I had prepared myself for a long, grueling process, but with the evidence I had, there was little she or her lawyer could contest. The court ruled decisively in my favor, granting me the majority of our shared assets and ensuring she had no claim to anything more. Watching her sit there, realizing how far she had fallen, was bittersweet. Part of me felt vindicated, the other part was simply tired. I didn't hate her anymore, I just wanted to move on. Her boss, the mastermind behind the entire operation, wasn't as lucky. The police investigation had uncovered more than enough to convict him, and the trial was a formality. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the company's operations were dismantled completely. Hearing the verdict gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Knowing he couldn't exploit anyone else was a small victory in a much larger battle. My ex-wife moved in with her mother after everything fell apart. Jobless and disgraced, she had no choice but to retreat to the safety of family. I heard bits and pieces about her life from mutual acquaintances. She was struggling to find work and seemed to be floundering in the wake of her choices. I didn't take any pleasure in her suffering, but I couldn't say I felt sympathy either. Actions have consequences, and she was living with hers. For me, the decision to sell the house was an easy one. It held too many memories, too much weight from everything that had happened. The sale went smoothly, and I used the money to pay off the remaining debts that had loomed over us for years. Moving into a smaller, simpler home felt like shedding old skin. It was a fresh start, free from the ghosts of a life that no longer belonged to me. One of the unexpected outcomes of this ordeal was the gratitude I received from the women who had been victims of the company. The 10 former employees who had come forward to testify sent me a heartfelt message of thanks after the trial. They were rebuilding their lives, some pursuing education, others starting new careers. Knowing I'd played a small part in their journey toward healing was humbling. It reminded me that even in the darkest situations, there's room for good to emerge. Looking back on everything, I often ask myself how it got to this point. Could I have seen it coming? Could I have done something differently? The truth is, I don't think so. My wife's choices were her own, shaped by her values and priorities, or lack thereof. I trusted her because I wanted to believe in the life we were building together. When that trust was broken, it wasn't just about the lies or the betrayal, it was about the foundation we had built crumbling beneath me. But if there's one lesson I've taken from all of this, it's the importance of paying attention to the signs. The small inconsistencies, the gut feelings, the moments when things didn't add up, they were all there, whispering truths I didn't want to hear. Ignoring them didn't make them go away, it just delayed the inevitable. Now, I listen to those instincts. They're what guided me through this mess, and they're what I'll rely on moving forward. Today, my life is simpler, quieter, and infinitely more peaceful. I don't have all the answers, and I don't pretend to. But I know this, I've learned who I am, what I stand for, and what I won't tolerate. That clarity is worth more than anything I lost. It's not about winning or losing, it's about knowing when to walk away. And I did. I walked away, and I'm better for it.